The night the iron cup hit the stone floor of Stormhaven's great hall, 40 lords held their breath. The wine spread across the granite, and the granite began to change. Not stain, mottle. A cold, creeping corruption that no wine had ever produced. In the silence that followed, every eye in the hall turned to the woman standing in the wreckage. Amber dress, flushed face, hands trembling at her sides. She looked like a woman who had just committed the most catastrophic accident in Winter Concord history. But King Calder Ashvane was not looking at the stone. He was looking at her. And his gray eyes held something no one in that hall had ever seen there before. Why did a healer's daughter from the outer reach just save a king who did not yet know he needed saving? And what was she willing to lose to do it? Stay with us, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. She had been 17 the first time she saw him. It was a tribute procession through the outer territories, the kind of slow, deliberate display that northern kings performed once a decade to remind the borderlands who held the ice. Seren had been standing on a frost-dusted road at the edge of Ashfeld village, a basket of winter herbs tucked against her hip, wearing her father's spare coat because the cold had come early that year, and she had not yet finished sewing her own. She had no expectations for the afternoon. Then Calder Ashvane rode through. He was on a pale gray destrier, wearing a cloak the color of storm clouds, and an expression that suggested the entire observable world had arranged itself as a mild inconvenience to him. His wolf, impossibly large, moving like smoke, padded silently beside the horse. His captains rode in formation behind him, their silver and black pennants snapping in the wind. And Seren, who had spent her whole life in a village of 200 people and a healer's cottage that smelled of dried sage and old parchment, felt her entire understanding of herself quietly rearrange. It was not that he was striking, though he was, in the severe, structural way that winter landscapes were striking, all sharp angles and gray depths. It was the way he carried the power, as though the dozens of armed men at his back were simply furniture, as though ruling the Stormlands was not something he performed, but something he simply was, the way glaciers were glaciers, the way the North was the North. She went home that evening and did something she would spend the next 5 years refusing to fully acknowledge. She started paying attention. Not in a dangerous way, or so she told herself. She was a healer's daughter with too many books and a mind that collected details the way starlings collected bright things, not on purpose, simply because it could not seem to stop. She heard reports. She read correspondence that passed through her father's hands when wounded men came through from the northern garrisons. She noticed patterns in what was said about the king and, more importantly, what was never said. She learned that he never raised his voice in council, and that this was somehow more terrifying than shouting. She learned that he had ended 2 border conflicts not through war, but through the kind of strategic patience that other men mistook for inaction. Until one morning the opposing lords woke to find every supply line they possessed quietly, efficiently severed. She learned the names of the lords who had tested his limits, and the quiet, permanent way each of them had eventually stopped. She built entire private worlds around a man she had never spoken to, and now, 5 years later, at 22, she was being summoned to his keep on a royal seal, riding a borrowed horse through the mountain pass with a satchel of medical ledgers pressed against her side. Wearing an amber dress she had altered 3 times before leaving, because it does not matter how you look, Seren. This is a professional matter. Stop adjusting the collar. The outer gates of Stormhaven were hewn from black granite, quarried in the fell mountains. Every stone placed with the precision of a man who understood that architecture was itself a form of language. The walls said, "We have weathered worse than whatever you were bringing." The guards were expecting her. They took her horse without a word and led her inside. The entrance corridor smelled of pine resin and cold iron, and something older beneath both. Wood smoke from fires that had burned in these hearths for 200 years, soaked into the stone until the stone had started breathing it back. Torch brackets shaped like wolves' heads lined the walls, their flames casting everything in amber and dark gold. His shoulders are broader than the portraits, she thought, before she had even entered the throne room. She had seen his silhouette through the open doors, just for a moment, just a shape in the firelight. And the thought had arrived without permission. She stopped it immediately, smoothed her expression, straightened her spine. This is a census review. You are here about garrison medical records. You are a professional. The throne room doors opened. King Calder Ashvane sat on an iron-carved seat at the far end of the hall, as though the chair had grown up around him. One hand rested on the throne's arm. His wolf, Ash they called her for the color of her coat, lay curled at his feet like a second shadow, her size somehow more impossible up close. Calder was reading a document when Seren entered. He did not look up immediately. The fire in the wall sconces cast him in amber and dark gold. He looked, and this was the thought Seren would spend considerable energy trying to suppress in the weeks to come, like winter, that had decided, one long-ago century, to take a human shape and had never quite figured out how to be comfortable in it. Then Calder Ashvane looked up. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, something in the hall went profoundly, unnaturally still. Ash raised her head. The king's eyes, dark gray, almost black, the color of deep water before a storm, found Seren's across the length of the room. Something moved behind them. Sharp, startled, there and gone in the space of a breath. Seren noticed none of it. She was too busy arranging her face into the expression of a woman with entirely ordinary thoughts. She crossed the hall, stopped at the appropriate distance, folded her hands in front of her in the exact posture of composed professional courtesy that she had practiced in the mirror of her father's cottage 3 separate times before departing. Seren of Ashfeld, Calder said. Healer's daughter. Outer reach, east border. His voice. She had not been prepared for his voice. It was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need room because it simply occupied whatever space it entered. And the effect of it against the stone walls of the throne room was... She needed to stop thinking about his voice immediately. Yes, Your Majesty. She was proud of how level that came out. You were summoned regarding the Eastern Garrison census. Your father treated injured men from the Fell Mountain campaigns. We require his records for the territorial assessment. He set the document aside and regarded her with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that silence made people say more than they intended. Of course. She opened the satchel at her hip. I brought the originals and 2 annotated copies. My father's handwriting is particular. I've translated the shorthand in the margins and cross-referenced the treatment dates against the garrison rotation logs and resorted everything chronologically because the original filing system was organized by injury type, which is medically logical, but makes temporal pattern analysis difficult. A beat of silence. Thorough, he said. I also rewrote the 3rd ledger because the first version had a water stain on the cover page, and I wanted the presentation to be clean, and I cannot explain why I cared about that without this conversation becoming very uncomfortable. This is fine. This is professional. She kept her voice neutral. My father taught me that detail is a form of respect. Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth. How long have you worked alongside him? Since I was 12. Before that, mostly reading. The village archive whenever I could access it. Medical texts, battle histories, garrison supply analyses, territorial maps, anything that mentioned the Stormlands, anything that mentioned... She stopped the thought, closed that door. Calder studied her. Ash's amber eyes shifted to Seren and stayed there with an attention that felt uncomfortably intelligent. The wolf has extraordinary eyes, she noticed, entirely against her will. Almost the same gray as his. I wonder if that's a bonding phenomenon. If alpha kings and their wolves begin to resemble each other with time. Or if he simply... She focused on the ledger in her hands with renewed intent. Your annotations, Calder said. Reference an irregularity in the Eastern supply timing. 3rd quarter, last year. And here, at least, was solid ground. The delivery windows don't align with the route distances. She stepped forward slightly, turning the ledger toward him so he could see the marked entries. The supplies logged as arriving from the central depot, but the condition of the provisions at intake, the spoilage rates, the moisture content, suggests a longer transit time. At minimum, 4 additional days, which means either the records are inaccurate or the route changed without formal notation. And in either case, someone in the provisioning chain knows and hasn't reported it. She said it cleanly, without hesitation, because she had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and she knew she was right. Calder was quiet for a moment. In that silence, Seren became aware that she had moved closer than protocol strictly required to show him the ledger, that she could see the gray-black of his eyes without the length of the throne room to soften them, and that his hands, resting now on the document she'd passed him, bore a scar along the left knuckles that continued, she noticed, to the one on his jaw. That's a connected scar. A single wound. The portraits never showed. "You've been sitting with this for longer than the summons," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "I noticed it 2 months ago. I thought it might be an anomaly. And then? I noticed it wasn't." He looked up then, directly at her, in a way she recognized from the historical accounts she had read. Not the court gaze, not the measured appraisal he aimed at lords and supplicants, but something else. The look of a man who has said, "Show me," and actually wants to see. "Stay," he said simply. It was not, she understood, an invitation. She had been given rooms in the East Wing, modest but warm, with a window that overlooked the inner courtyard and a writing desk that someone had stocked with ink, parchment, and a stack of blank ledger pages before she arrived, as though the keep had known she would need them. She had been there 3 days when she found the wolf. Ash was in the corridor outside her rooms at dawn, lying across the threshold with her vast silver head on her paws, watching the door with amber patience. Seren stood in the doorway for a long moment, clutching her wash basin, trying to determine if this was a threat assessment or something else entirely. Ash thumped her tail once against the stone floor. "You are enormous," Seren told her. Ash appeared to take this as a compliment. It became a habit. The wolf appeared each morning, walked with Seren to the archives, where she'd been given access to review the supply records, and lay outside the archive door with the same enormous, quiet patience until Seren emerged. The first time Calder saw it, crossing the inner courtyard as Seren and Ash moved through it, he stopped, looked at his wolf for a long moment, with an expression Seren couldn't read, and said nothing. Ash looked back at him with the expression of an animal that had made a decision and found it entirely reasonable. The wound happened on the 4th day. She found him in the armory courtyard just after midday, drilling with 2 of his captains. She had been taking a different route to the archives. She had gotten turned around in the keep's east passage, which branched unexpectedly and had what appeared to be a false wall that she was fairly certain was a door but could not locate the mechanism for, and had emerged into the training yard at an inopportune moment. What she saw stopped her at the archway. He moved the way she had imagined. She was honest enough, at least internally, to admit she had imagined he would move. Not like a man performing skill for an audience, but like water finding the path of least resistance. Economical, unhurried, absolute. His opponents were good. He was something else. Then one of the captains landed a training blow to his left forearm, and even across the courtyard, Seren heard the sharp intake of breath that a man makes when the pain is more than he expected. The captain stepped back. Calder lowered his arm. Blood welled through a cut in his sleeve where a training blade had caught a gap in his sparring guard. She crossed the courtyard before she had consciously decided to. "That needs cleaning," she said. Both captains turned. Calder looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise. A slight tension in the jaw, a fractional pause before response. "It's a training graze. It's deeper than it looks, and there's sawdust in the courtyard." She held out her hand, the way she had learned with difficult patience. Not demanding, simply present. "I have supplies in my room. 10 minutes." The captains were watching with elaborate casualness. Ash, who had materialized at some point behind Seren, sat down and waited. Calder looked at his wolf, then at Seren. He followed her. Her room was small enough that when he sat in the chair she'd pulled from the desk, and she stood over his arm to clean the wound, they were closer than they had been in the throne room. Much closer. Close enough that she could see where the gray in his hair began at his temples. Not from age, she thought, just from whatever had happened to him before she had existed as a fact of the world. And close enough that she could hear him breathe. She cleaned the cut methodically, the way her father had taught her. Cold water first, then the astringent that made patients hiss, then the honey and herb packing that actually closed things. He didn't hiss. "You can react," she said. "It's an appropriate response to antiseptic." "I'm fine. You're holding your breath." A pause. "Breathe out," she said, and went back to the wound. He breathed out. She pressed the herb packing into the cut with careful fingers, and for a few minutes there was only the sound of the fire in the small hearth, and his slow, deliberate breathing, and the close, warm smell of pine resin, and the astringent, and something under both that she was trying very hard not to identify as simply him. "He is right there," she thought unhelpfully. "His hand is right there, and I am holding it, and this is a medical procedure, and I am completely—" "You're thinking very loudly," Calder said. She looked up. His gray eyes were watching her from a distance of approximately 18 inches, with an expression that was very hard to read in the warm light of her small fire. "I'm concentrating," she said. "I know." Something shifted in his face, just slightly, just enough to make her stomach do something inconvenient. "So am I." She looked back at the wound, wrapped the linen binding with slightly more concentration than the task strictly required, tied it off. "Done," she said, stepping back. He did not move immediately. His arm rested across his knee, the white linen bright against his sleeve, and he was looking at the bound wound with an expression she could not catalogue because she had never seen it before, on any face, in any report she had ever read. Like something unfamiliar settling. "Thank you," he said finally, simply. "It's what I know how to do." He stood. He was large in her small room. She had known this in the abstract way that she had known everything about him in the abstract, for years. But abstract knowledge turned out to be a very poor preparation for the actual man crossing the actual 6 feet of her actual room toward the door. He paused in the doorway. "The East Passage," he said, without turning. "The false wall. Press the 3rd torch bracket from the left. It's a maintenance corridor, not a secret passage, despite what it looks like." He left. Ash, who had been sitting in the hall, looked into the room at Seren with amber eyes that contained an opinion. "Don't," Seren told her. Ash thumped her tail twice. The Winter Concord began on the 6th day of her stay. 40 lords from across the northern reaches arrived over 2 days, filling Stormhaven's great hall with the kind of controlled, elegant hostility that Seren associated with all the court histories she had read. Everyone watching everyone else, cataloging weaknesses, deciding in real time who was useful and who was not. She understood it intellectually. She understood it considerably better standing in the great hall during the first formal assembly, with 40 pairs of eyes finding reasons to drift in her direction. "They are deciding what I am," she thought. "A mistake? A distraction? Or a threat?" She stood in the minor nobles gallery, 3rd row, correct position for her rank, and watched them decide. The lord who worried her most was not the loudest. He was a man of about 50, named Lord Goldholt, which in the old northern tongue meant Gold Guardian. An irony so pointed it had to be intentional, given what she suspected about the treasury records she had begun quietly cross-referencing with the supply anomalies. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that performed trustworthiness so convincingly She had learned years ago to distrust it on sight. He spoke well. He listened in a way that made people feel heard, without conceding anything. He had the easy authority of a man who had arranged this room before the guests arrived. Across the hall, she saw Calder standing with his senior captains. He appeared to be focused entirely on the border rotation report his lieutenant was delivering. He did not look at her. She felt, somehow, that he was listening. The supply presentation came in the second hour. The provisional steward, a thin-faced man named Osric, whom she had noticed speaking with Goldholt 3 times in the span of an hour for no discernible administrative reason, presented the winter reserve numbers with the smooth, practiced confidence of someone who has memorized a story and told it many times. Seren looked at the figures on the board behind him. Stable, month over month. Perfectly, uniformly stable. Real reserves fluctuate, she thought, working through it quickly. They reflect weather delays, spoilage estimates, transit variance. These numbers have been managed. Someone has decided what the record should show, and then made the record show it. And if the actual stores are even a quarter lower than reported, the northern garrison enters winter without sufficient reserves to maintain troop strength through a prolonged cold season, she finished, very quietly, to no one. Find something? She turned, slowly. Calder was beside her. He had crossed the hall at a pace that had apparently indicated nothing of significance to anyone in the room, because no one's head had turned. I found the board very interesting, she said. Seren? She looked back at the numbers. The variance is wrong. Real stores don't read like this. Someone is managing what the records show, and whoever it is has access to the provisional ledgers at the senior level. She paused. Goldholt's steward has been to the records table twice since the assembly began. He shouldn't have reason for that. Calder said nothing. I'm not imagining it, she added, because the silence had a particular quality. I know, he said. You don't imagine, you observe. Something shifted in his voice, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the careful distance that usually occupied it. I've been watching you watch this room for 6 days. You haven't missed anything yet. She kept her eyes on the board. Her heart was doing something that was medically inconvenient. The seal, she said, after a moment. For the provisioner records. I saw it used in the East Corridor 3 nights before I was summoned. Goldholt's man. A document transfer. The seal authorizes movement of Treasury-linked supply records. Calder went very still. Not the performed stillness. Something private. Come with me, he said. The map room was at the end of the east wing, past the false wall, and through the maintenance corridor that she now knew how to navigate. It smelled of parchment and cold stone, and the particular mineral sharpness of map ink. Charts covered every wall. Territorial boundaries, garrison positions, supply routes marked in precise notation. A long oak table ran the center of the room, spread with documents his council had been reviewing for weeks. He was already at the table when she arrived, studying the northern route overlay. She took the opposite side. She was honest enough to acknowledge this was not purely about strategy, and pointed to the anomalies she had found. Here and here. She placed her finger on 2 separate route lines. The adjusted transit times I flagged in the garrison records. If you overlay them against the reserve drawdown periods, they align, he said. Someone is pulling from the northern stores during the record alteration window. The supplies move, but the stated destination is unverified. The paperwork shows transit. The garrison never receives. He moved around the table. She had not planned for him to come to her side of it, and now there were approximately 12 inches between them, and the firelight from the wall sconce was behind his left shoulder, and she was trying to focus on the maps with the concentration of someone diffusing something delicate. The provisional steward has access, she continued, but the seal authorizes him. Goldholt arranged for that authorization, which means it's not coming from outside the court, Calder said quietly. It never was. He was looking at the supply route lines. Then he looked at her. In 5 years of reading reports, of building private worlds around the shape of his decisions and the architecture of his restraint, she had never prepared for this. The experience of being looked at by him directly, without the throne room's length between them, without performance or management, simply seen. "You've been carrying this since before you arrived," he said. "I didn't know what it was yet. I thought it was an administrative irregularity. And then, I thought it might be worth mentioning to you." She paused. "In case it mattered." The fire shifted in the sconce. Something in his posture released, very slightly, nearly imperceptibly. The kind of release she might not have noticed if she had not spent years learning the architecture of how he held himself. "He believes me," she thought, "without requiring proof of my credentials, or references, or 3 supporting witnesses. He simply—" "I prepared extensively," she said quietly, "for the possibility of not being believed." "I know." His voice was low. "I heard you." She looked up. "In the throne room," he said. "The first day, I heard you thinking." His expression was steady, neutral. She was learning to read the gradations beneath the surface. Not fragments. Clearly, the bond between an alpha and their mate sometimes. "I have never heard anyone before. I didn't understand what it was at first." The word mate landed in the room quietly, like the first snowflake of a winter that was about to become something significant. Seren looked at the maps. She did several calculations simultaneously. "How long?" she asked. "Since the moment you crossed the threshold." "So the entire throne room." "The entire— You heard me thinking about your—" She stopped, reorganized. "You heard everything." "Yes." The silence stretched. "I need a moment," she said. "Take the time you need." She walked to the window. It overlooked the inner courtyard, dark now, the stones slick with the season's first frost. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and thought, with great precision, about everything she had thought in his presence since the throne room, and felt the specific, articulated mortification of a woman who had spent 5 years building private worlds she had believed were private. He hadn't laughed. He had access to 5 years of catalogued observation, and he had not laughed. Not once. Not even the particular controlled kind of laugh that some powerful men use to diminish rather than find genuine humor. He had come to check if she was sleeping. She turned around. "You could have told me," she said. "You should have." "I know. That's not an apology." "No." He looked at her across the room, steady, gray, unflinching. "I didn't know what to do with it. I have never—" He paused, and the pause was the most human thing she had seen him do. "You thought I was lonely." "I thought you were alone," she said, "which is different." The fire, the maps, the 12 inches, and the cold glass at her back. "The most capable man I had ever studied," she said carefully, "and also profoundly alone." I noticed because I recognized the shape of it. I had seen it from a road when I was 17, and I never stopped recognizing it. She paused. "I have been alone in a different way, and I knew what it looked like, even at a distance." Calder was quiet for longer than he had been quiet yet. In the stone and firelight silence, the maps spread between them like a territory neither had quite agreed to enter. "No one has seen me clearly," he said, finally, "in a long time." She said nothing. "They see the crown, the wolf, the war. They see what I allow them to see." He looked at her. "You saw the rest without my permission and kept it like something worth keeping." "I didn't know what else to do with it," she said honestly. The wolf, who had been silent near the door, raised her head and looked at Calder with an expression that contained an opinion. And then the door opened, and one of Calder's senior captains was in the frame, with the particular quality of urgency that is very controlled, because urgency in a king's household must always be controlled. "My lord, Goldholt's man in the corridor." Osric has been seen accessing the provisional vault with the silver seal. Tonight. Calder looked at Seren once. In that look was every word the interruption had prevented. Then he moved. The night of the formal feast, Seren sat in the minor nobles section and watched Ivar Goldholt perform graciousness the way certain spiders spun webs, not quickly, not ostentatiously, but with a patience so complete it almost looked like ease. He moved through the assembled lords, refilling cups with his own hand, an old northern gesture of hospitality. Laughing at appropriate moments, asking questions he already knew the answers to, and listening as though he didn't. He looked like a man who had forgotten the previous day's assembly. He had not forgotten it at all. The ceremonial fire burned high in the central pit. Long tables arranged in formal horseshoe configuration around it, the high seat centered at the top, where Calder sat, with his senior lords arranged in descending authority. He had not looked at her since the feast began. She did not take this personally. She was too busy watching Osric. The steward moved along the far wall with the deliberate casualness of a man trying to look as though he was doing nothing. He passed the wine table. He passed the salted bread table. He paused at the ceremonial display, the carved wooden chest containing the Concord documents, the silver cup, the ritual salt. He was not there for the documents or the salt. Seren watched his hands. 4 minutes. A small folded cloth palmed under the edge of his sleeve. The ceramic interior of the cup briefly handled. She ran the calculation. If she was wrong, she would cause a social incident significant enough to confirm every unflattering assessment of her judgment that Goldholt had been carefully constructing over the past 2 days. If she was right, she rose from her seat. The formal address had begun. Calder stood at the high table, delivering the seasonal declaration in the sparse, unornamented language he used for all formal occasions. Direct, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who had never needed rhetoric. Goldholt presented the ceremonial cup with both hands and a formal bow. Calder's hand closed around it. Seren walked directly into the senior captain standing between her and the high table. She did not do it gently. The collision was decisive, undeniable, and resulted in her grabbing the ceremonial table's edge for balance with both hands. The table lurched. The cup left Calder's hand. It struck the hearthstone floor, and the contents spread in a dark arc across the firelit granite, and in the sudden, frozen silence of a hall, watching what appeared to be the most catastrophic social accident in living memory, everyone watched the granite begin to change. Not stain. Model. A gray-white corruption spreading through the stone that no fermented grape had ever, in the history of fermented grapes, produced. The silence changed. Seren straightened. Her face was flushed, and her amber dress was wine-splashed, and she looked precisely like a woman who had just destroyed the Concord ceremony through spectacular clumsiness. "I am so sorry," she said, to the room, to the captain, to the air. "I completely misjudged I've been unwell, I think. I lost my balance entirely. Please forgive me." She did not look at Goldholt. She looked at the mottled stone and felt Calder's gaze find her with the precision of an arrow that has always known where it is going. Osric, she thought, clearly, with the full force of everything she had. He has not left his position. He needs to not be permitted to leave this room. Across the hall, she heard Ash get to her feet. By the second hour of deep night, Stormhaven was no longer quiet. It happened while Seren was being escorted to the inner keep rooms, a precaution, the captain said, while the investigation of the cup was underway. She heard the outer gate bell first, then a sound beneath the wind that was wrong in the particular way organized violence was wrong. From her window, the inner courtyard filling with unfamiliar men, unmarked armor, formation discipline that spoke of paid swords rather than loyal ones, gate guards standing aside. Goldholt had not improvised this. He had been building it for months, and now she was watching it open like a mechanism wound slowly and released all at once. She found Calder in the center of it. She always found him immediately. She had stopped being embarrassed about this approximately 2 days ago. He was fighting brilliantly. Controlled, precise, technically exceptional. Every movement filtered through the awareness of a man who understood that how a king appeared in battle was itself a political statement. And it was costing him. She saw it from the window. The slight over-consideration before each decision, the wolf's instincts running half a second ahead of the choice to act on them. He was managing Ash's intelligence in the middle of combat because he could not be seen as feral. Because the lords watching from the galleries would carry whatever story they told themselves tonight for the rest of their political lives. And feral was the word that had always been waiting to be applied to an alpha king who let the wolf fully in. And it was going to get him killed. She opened the window. The guard outside her door turned. "My lady, 1 moment," she said, and leaned out into the cold air above the courtyard. She had never shouted across a battlefield. She was not the kind of person who did that. She was a healer's daughter from the outer reach who read supply records and noticed things. Calder. Not a scream, something more deliberate than that. Projected, carrying, the voice of someone who had decided to stop being careful. He looked up. Across the courtyard, through the smoke and the torchlight and the chaos of men who had been paid to do something irreversible, his gray eyes found her window. "Stop fighting like they're watching," she called. "They're not watching you anymore. They're trying to survive you. Let them." She felt the bond open. She had not known she would be able to feel it. Had not known until this moment that the bond ran both ways, that the thing that let him hear her thoughts was also a door she could push. But she felt it open in her chest, like a room full of cold air suddenly warmed, and she put into it everything she had, her certainty, her fury on his behalf, and beneath both of those, the things she had been keeping in careful storage since the map room and the wound binding, and the 12 inches of fire-lit space. You are not frightening when you hold back. You are frightening when you are whole. Let them see what you are. A single interior release, like a door that had been held shut for years, simply opening. The wolf rose. What followed was not, technically, a military engagement anymore. It was something older and more efficient. Calder moving through the courtyard with Ash's full intelligence. Not filtered, not managed, simply present. Reading the battle the way glaciers read landscape. Completely, permanently, without sentimentality. The formation collapsed in under 3 minutes. The mercenaries lost cohesion. The loyal men of Stormhaven rallied toward the sound of the wolf and fought with the renewed force of people who had just remembered what it was they were protecting. Seren watched with her heart hammering and something fierce and bright and entirely too large for the window she was standing at, expanding in her chest. And then the panel in her eastern wall moved. She had been looking for the mechanism since her 3rd day. She found out it operated from the inside when Goldholt stepped through it with 2 men at his back and a drawn blade. He looked at her with the measured calm of a man who had planned for every contingency. Who had, she realized, always planned for her. Had seen the threat she represented since the moment she stood up in the assembly and named the numbers in the supply ledgers in front of 40 lords. "The outer courtyard is somewhat occupied," he said pleasantly, "but kings, in my experience, tend to reconsider their positions when presented with the right leverage." She kept her face still. The fear was real. She had said so once, to Calder, and she stood by it. She was genuinely afraid. She was simply choosing not to perform it for an audience. "The passage behind the wall," she said. "I should have found that sooner." "Most people don't look." "I was not most people in this keep," she said, "and I think you knew that, which is why you moved so quickly after the assembly." Something flickered in his face. Not respect, exactly. She did not think Goldholt's face was built for honest respect, but the recognition of an equal he had underestimated. He gestured to his men. They brought her through the lower passage and out into the eastern arch of the courtyard, precisely where the fighting had broken open. The battle had not ended so much as paused, the way violence sometimes did when something more significant entered the space. Goldholt's remaining men held a perimeter. Calder's guard had stopped advancing. In the center of it, Calder stood, Ash at his side. Blood on his sleeve from a cut she hadn't bandaged yet, something she registered and filed immediately. His gray eyes found her the moment she appeared. She felt it through the bond. Not words, something underneath words. A sound the body made before language arrived. "Stand down," Goldholt said, with the carrying confidence of a man who believed he had finally found the right lever. "Surrender the seal and step back from your position. A Regency Council will restore stability. No more blood tonight. The choice is simple." Calder said nothing. In the silence, Seren understood what was being decided. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the calculation that every king eventually faced. The individual against the institution, the person against the crown. He had never in his entire reign chosen himself over the duty. She knew this the way she knew supply route distances and garrison rotation patterns, and the war tune he hummed when he thought no one was listening. He would stand down. He would find another way. He would be what the throne required. And she would be the acceptable loss. And he would carry it, alone, behind the silence, for the rest of his life. She could not even be angry at him for it. She had understood who he was before she ever spoke to him. "It is all right," she thought, with complete honesty, into the open bond. "I knew who you were. I understood the weight of it." "Whatever you choose," Calder walked forward. "She is my mate." He said it without volume, without performance. The way he said everything that was true, as a statement of fact that had stopped requiring his permission to exist. It landed in the courtyard like a change in weather. She could feel the recalibration ripple through every man present, the sudden, urgent reassessment on every face, the realignment of calculation and allegiance. A mate bond was not sentiment, not preference. It was the Alpha King's nature, inviolable, irrevocable, biological fact. Threatening his mate was no longer a negotiating position. It was a sentence that had just been spoken aloud. "Any man who harms her," Calder continued, still walking, Ash moving at his flank, "does not leave this courtyard." Goldholt's composure fractured, just slightly. Just enough. His eyes moved to his men, a half-second, and Calder had been waiting for exactly that. The wolf moved first. What followed was precise and efficient and not prolonged. Goldholt was disarmed. His men were contained. By morning, his network had unraveled with the specific momentum of a structure whose foundation has been pulled. The steward Osric's testimony, the provisional seal records, the ledger alterations Seren had documented, all of it assembling into a case so complete that the lords who had cautiously aligned with Goldholt's faction spent the remainder of the night making very deliberate, very audible decisions about their loyalties. The rebellion ended not with a declaration. It ended with paperwork and truth, which turned out, as it always did, to be more durable than the violence. She found him there. Of course she did. She had known, for 2 years before she set foot in Stormhaven, that it was where he went when the performance was finished and the king could briefly stop being a monument. She had stopped pretending she didn't know things about him 2 days ago, approximately. He was standing at the long table when she came in, not looking at the maps. She closed the door, stood with her back against it, looked at the man who had just declared her his mate in front of his entire assembled court, and was now staring at territorial documentation with the focused attention of someone who had used up all their composure. "You heard it," she said. "In the courtyard. What I was thinking." "Yes. I thought you would choose the kingdom." "I know." He turned to face her. The fire was behind him, the maps spread across the table between them, the blood on his sleeve dark against the gray cloth. "I heard that too." The room was very still. Outside the narrow window, the first pale gray of pre-dawn was beginning at the horizon's edge. "I've been thinking about how to say this for 5 years," she said. "I was better at it in my head. In my head, there was much less." She gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the reality of him, at the comprehensive inadequacy of 5 years of imagination as preparation for the actual man. Context. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Say it however you need to," he said. She looked at him, at the blood on his sleeve and the gray-dark eyes, and the scar that no portrait had ever correctly rendered, and the silver beginning at his temples, and decided she was done being careful. "I have loved you since I was 17 years old," she said, "standing on a frost-covered road, watching you ride past as though you owned the weather. I built entire worlds around a man I had never spoken to. I learned your habits and your grief, and the tune you hum when you think no one is listening. I learned the names of every lord who had tested your patience. I told myself it was simply observation, the way my mind worked, the way it always collected bright things. But I knew what it was." She paused. "I knew what it was the whole time." The silence stretched out into something that was not quite silence anymore. And then Calder Ashvane, the man who had conquered 4 northern territories without raising his voice, who had been crowned not by ceremony, but by the kind of war that leaves no songs behind, who had maintained a silence so complete for so long that his entire court had made a mythology of it, laughed, freely, fully, with the unguarded quality of someone who had not done it that way in long enough that the sound surprised him. It transformed his face entirely, and Seren stood against the door experiencing the specific disorientation of a woman who has spent 5 years building a comprehensive understanding of a person and has just discovered that reality is capable of exceeding imagination in a direction she had not considered. "I heard you thinking about my wolf cloak," he said, "within 30 seconds of you entering the throne room. I know. I've made my peace with that. You thought Ash deserved her own formal title. I stand by the assessment. She is exceptional." He crossed to her. No performance, no management. Simply closing the distance between them with his full attention on her face, the way he did everything that mattered to him, completely, without pretense, without the careful management of appearance that he maintained for the rest of the observable world. He stopped close enough that she had to look up. "You were afraid," he said, "every moment, from the throne room forward." She held his gaze. "I was afraid, and I paid attention anyway. I believe that's the relevant distinction." "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." He reached up, slowly enough that she could see the intention in it, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of 2 fingers. Not a dramatic gesture. Not the kind of thing that appeared in the courtly romances she had occasionally, under protest, read. Just the simple, deliberate act of a man who had decided something and was acting on it. Ash settled at their feet with the air of an animal who considered the matter entirely concluded, and had, in fact, considered it concluded since approximately the 2nd morning, when she sat outside the door in the east corridor. In the weeks that followed, the court of Stormhaven learned new signals. The Alpha King still did not shout, still carried his silence with him like a second shadow. But the silence had changed, inhabited rather than empty, carrying something warm beneath the cold the way northern stone did when you pressed your palm to it on a sunny afternoon, unexpectedly. Seren was not invisible. She had never, it turned out, been invisible. She had simply been in rooms full of people who had not been paying sufficient attention. The court paid attention now, with the careful interest due to a woman who had named supply discrepancies in front of 40 lords, interrupted an assassination with apparent clumsiness, and been claimed by the Alpha King in the middle of a courtyard battle without anyone being entirely certain how any of it had happened. She found she did not mind being looked at. She minded being misread, which was a different problem, and one she was increasingly well-positioned to address. The bond required no management. It had never required management. only the courage to stop treating honesty as a liability. Calder heard her thoughts and stopped concealing that he heard them. Seren discovered that being known completely was not the catastrophe she had spent years expecting, but something closer to its opposite. He was not, as it turned out, a man who said sweet things. He did not compose declarations or speak the language of the courtly tradition his court expected of a king with a mate. What he did instead, in the mornings, was leave the window shutters open on the side that caught the early light, because she had thought once, clearly in his hearing, that morning light on stone was her favorite thing about the keep. What he did instead was appear in the archive when her candle burned low, without announcement, and read his own documents in the chair by her table until she was finished. What he did instead was press his thumb to the inside of her wrist, once, briefly, when she stood at his shoulder during a council report that was going badly, and she felt his pulse there, and he felt hers, and neither of them looked away from the documents, and nothing was said, and everything was understood. What he did, on the evening she found him in the map room, with the autumn wind coming off the fell mountains, and the new routes spread across the table, was stand behind her while she traced the corrected supply lines with her finger, and lower his chin to her shoulder, and breathe out slowly against her hair, and say nothing at all. Which was, she had learned, how he said everything. Ash was, as Seren had maintained from the beginning, entirely insufferable about having been right. She sat in whatever room they occupied, with the specific satisfaction of an animal who made a decision once and had never once doubted it, and regarded the world from that position of complete, comfortable vindication. The king who had been crowned by war and maintained by silence, the healer's daughter who had been paying attention from a frost-covered road for 5 years. Both of them, finally, known. There was no silence between them now. Neither of them missed it. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with declarations or grand gestures. It arrives quietly, in the way someone remembers how you take your tea, in the way they leave the window open because they once heard you say, "Morning light on stone" was your favorite thing, in the way they stand between you and the dark without being asked and say nothing about it afterward. Seren did not fall in love with a king. She fell in love with the silence behind the king, the grief he carried without complaint, the weight he held without asking anyone to share it, the war tune he hummed when he believed no one was listening. She paid attention to the parts of him the world had decided were not worth seeing. And Calder did not fall in love with a woman who was fearless. He fell in love with one who was afraid, genuinely, completely afraid, and paid attention anyway. That is the only kind of courage that has ever mattered. To be known fully, not partially. To let someone see the soft and frightened thing behind every wall you built, and discover that what they do with it is not use it against you, but keep it carefully, like something worth keeping. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing two people can do for each other. If this story found something in you tonight, a feeling you recognize, a love you remember, or one you are still waiting for, drop it in the comments. We read every single one, and your words are what keep these stories alive. If you want more, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Every new story we tell exists because you showed up for the last one. Thank you for being here. We will see you next time. Epilogue. What comes after winter? They say the Alpha King of Stormhaven never changed. The Lord still feared him. The captain still obeyed without question. The wolf still cleared a path through any crowded corridor, simply by existing in it. What they did not say, because they were not present for it, because it happened in the private hours behind closed doors and warm hearths, was that the man inside the king had changed completely. The evidence, if one knew where to look, was everywhere. It was in the window that was always left open on the east side of the royal chambers, in the stack of medical texts that had appeared, inexplicably, on the war table, in the way the Alpha King of the northern reaches could occasionally be found, in the deep quiet of a winter evening, making faces at an infant who found this absolutely hilarious. History, as always, missed the best parts. The baby arrived in the first snowfall of their second winter together. Seren had been characteristically prepared. She had annotated 3 separate midwifery texts, reorganized the medical supply cabinet twice, and written out a contingency plan that covered 17 distinct scenarios, which she had presented to Calder in the map room 6 weeks prior, with the same methodical clarity she brought to supply chain analyses. He had read every page. He had also, without comment, moved his war council meetings to the outer hall for the final month of her pregnancy, so that she could use the map room as a rest space. Because it had the best hearth in the keep, and she had mentioned once, in passing, that the warmth helped her back. She had not reminded him. He had simply done it. This was, she had come to understand, how Calder Ashvane said, "I love you." Not in words, but in the quiet rearrangement of his entire world around whatever she needed, executed without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement. It was, objectively, more devastating than any declaration. The baby was a boy, dark-haired, gray-eyed, with an expression of mild, considered dissatisfaction at the world that Seren recognized immediately. "He looks exactly like you," she said, when the midwife placed him in her arms. Calder, standing at her shoulder with the particular stillness of a man experiencing something he had no framework for, looked at his son for a long moment. "He looks angry," he said. "That is your face," Seren said. "That is the face you make at council reports." A pause. "I don't make that face at council reports." "Calder, you make that face at breakfast." The baby opened his eyes, gray, the exact gray of a winter sky before snow, and looked up at his father with an expression of absolute, solemn assessment. Calder looked back. Something cracked open in his face, very quietly, the way ice cracked in early spring. Not breaking, just shifting, just beginning to let the light through. "Eric," he said. It was not a question. Seren looked at him. He had not mentioned names. She had a list of 17, annotated by origin and historical significance, waiting on the desk. "Eric," she agreed. Ash, who had been lying across the threshold with the patience of an animal who had decided this was her post, and no one was going to argue with her about it, bumped her tail 3 times against the stone floor. The first month was an education for everyone. Eric was, constitutionally, a person with opinions. He had opinions about feeding schedules, about which specific position he preferred to be held in, about the particular wool blanket, the gray one, not the cream one. He was extremely clear about this, and about the unacceptable frequency with which adults attempted to put him down, when he had not indicated any readiness to be put down. He communicated these opinions with considerable volume and specificity. Calder, who had maintained absolute composure through 4 territorial conflicts, 17 hostile council assemblies, and 1 assassination attempt, spent the 3rd night of Irik's life standing in the middle of their chambers at 2 a.m, holding his son against his chest with both massive hands, swaying in a slow rhythm that he had apparently arrived at through pure instinct, speaking in a voice Seren had never heard him use before, low, almost inaudible, the particular murmur of a large, fierce man who has discovered he is capable of being very, very gentle. She lay in the bed and watched him and did not say anything, because some moments were too complete to interrupt. Eric stopped crying. Calder looked down at him with the expression she now recognized as his version of being undone, that almost imperceptible softening around the jaw, the slight release of the shoulders, the gray eyes going quiet and warm. "He stopped," Calder said, very carefully, as though any sudden movement might reverse this. "You're warm," Seren said softly, "and you don't startle. He can feel that." Calder looked at his son for another moment. "He is very small," he said, with the tone of a man who had faced down warlords and found this somehow more significant. "He will get bigger." "I know." A pause. "I'm not sure if that's better or worse." Seren smiled into her pillow. "Ask me again when he's walking." The wolf accepted Eric with the gravity of an animal formalizing a treaty. She sniffed him, once, thoroughly, on his second day of existence. Looked at Calder, looked at Seren, looked back at the baby. Then she lay down beside the cradle and did not move for 6 hours. And that was that. Eirik had been annexed into whatever Ash considered her personal territory, and the matter was not open for discussion. By the time Eirik was 3 months old and beginning to notice the world with the bright, greedy curiosity of a person who has just realized there is a great deal of it, Ash had become his primary source of entertainment. He reached for her ears with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a small person who has not yet mastered fine motor control. Ash endured this with the patience of an ancient mountain. He grabbed her tail and held on. She looked at Calder with an expression that communicated, clearly, that she was doing this under protest and expected acknowledgement. He gave her a single nod of solemn recognition. She looked back at Eric and allowed the tail grabbing to continue. She is the most patient she has ever been with anyone, Calder observed one afternoon, watching Ash allow Eric to use her flank as a pillow while he slept. She was patient with me from the beginning, Seren said. That was different. She approved of you immediately. He glanced at her. She was making a point. To you? She was considerably less subtle than she believed herself to be. Seren considered this. Did it work? Calder's mouth moved in the particular way that, after 2 years, she knew meant he was trying not to smile and losing. I was already listening, he said. She was simply providing commentary. The court adapted. This was its primary skill: adaptation, recalibration, the continuous renegotiation of what was normal. And what was normal now included the Queen Consort attending supply council with a nursing infant in a linen wrap across her chest, and continuing to identify provisioning irregularities while doing so, which several lords found unsettling for reasons they could not quite articulate. It also included, occasionally, the Alpha King of Stormhaven arriving at morning council slightly late, without explanation, with what appeared to be a very small handprint in milk on his left shoulder. No one mentioned it. Lord Aldrich of the Eastern Reach mentioned it once. He gestured delicately toward his own shoulder. Calder looked at him. Aldrich decided the shoulder required no further comment, and returned his attention to the border reports. But the story that passed through the lower halls, quietly, warmly, the kind of story that people tell each other when they want to believe that powerful men can be made soft by the right things, was the one about the morning council that had been interrupted. A nursemaid had appeared at the door. There had been a brief exchange, too quiet for the assembled lords to hear, and Calder had risen, handed the border report to his captain, and said, with the same flat authority he used to end territorial disputes, "We're done for this morning." He had walked out. The assembled lords had looked at each other. "The child," his captain had said, by way of explanation, with the expression of a man who had served the king for 11 years, and was still occasionally surprised. The lords had decided, unanimously and without discussion, that this was entirely acceptable. She had not expected the tenderness. She had known who he was. She had studied him for years, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge was the only armor available to a person with no other kind. She had known about the silence and the control and the grief that had carved him young. She had known about the war and the crown and the weight of 17 years of ruling alone. She had not known about this. The way he held Eric against his chest in the evenings while she read, standing by the fire, one enormous hand spanning the baby's entire back, swaying in that slow rhythm, not because Eric was crying, but simply because he was there, and Calder was holding him, and this was sufficient reason for both of them. The way he learned, without asking her to teach him, exactly how she liked her morning tea, the specific steep time, the small amount of honey, the way the cup should be warm before the tea went in, and it appeared on the table beside her every morning, without comment, without expectation of thanks, without any indication that he had done anything other than what seemed obvious to him. The way he read to Eric. She had come into the map room one afternoon to find Calder seated in the chair by the fire, with Eric propped against his arm, reading aloud from a territorial history, in the low, unhurried voice she had once tried very hard not to find devastating. Eric was watching his father's face with the complete, solemn attention of a person who had decided this was the most important thing currently happening in the world. She had stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to interrupt. Calder had not looked up. "The third chapter is better," he said. "The military analysis is actually sound." "I know," she said. "I read it first." "Of course you did." She came and sat on the arm of the chair. He shifted to make room without breaking his sentence. Eric looked at her, looked at his father, looked back at her, with the expression that meant he was processing information and reserving judgment. Calder continued reading. Outside, the snow had begun again. The soft, unhurried kind that fell when the wind was still and the world went quiet. The fire crackled. Ash breathed steadily near the door. This, Seren thought, with the complete and settled certainty of someone who has found the exact right thing and knows it. This is what I was paying attention toward, all those years, without knowing it. This exact room, this exact warmth. Calder turned a page. His hand, the one not holding the book, found hers on the chair arm and covered it, briefly, without interruption to the reading. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. That was all. It was, as always, entirely sufficient. Eric said his first word at 10 months. Seren had been preparing for this. She had, naturally, read 4 texts on infant language development and had a working theory about which word would arrive first, based on frequency of exposure and phonetic accessibility. Her leading candidates were mama, statistically most common, or ash, given the wolf's omnipresence. She was wrong. They were in the Great Hall, a rare family appearance at the informal evening meal, the kind that happened when the formal council was finished and the court relaxed into something resembling actual humanity. Eric was on Calder's knee, engaged in his current favorite activity of attempting to confiscate whatever his father was holding, which tonight was a report from the northern garrison. Calder moved the report. Eric followed it with his whole body, leaning with the single-minded determination of a small person who has identified something and intends to have it. The assembled lords watched with the carefully neutral expressions of people who were absolutely paying attention. Calder looked down at his son. Eric looked up at his father. "No," said Eric, clearly, firmly, with considerable conviction. The hall went silent. Calder looked at his son for a long moment, with an expression that moved through several stages before arriving at something that was, unmistakably, startled pride. Seren pressed her hand over her mouth. "He," Calder said carefully, "said no." "He did," she agreed, her voice entirely steady, which was a significant personal achievement. His first word. "Yes." Another pause. "To me." "To the garrison report specifically," she said. "I think." Calder looked back at Eric, who had used the moment of distraction to successfully acquire a corner of the garrison report, and was now examining it with satisfaction. Said Calder. Lord Aldrich, from the far end of the table, made a sound that he converted with remarkable speed into a cough. Ash, from her position by the hearth, thumped her tail in what Seren had come to recognize as her amused rhythm. Calder handed Eric the rest of the report. "He can have it," he said, to no one in particular. "The northern garrison will survive a revision." The keep was quieter after Eric's bedtime. This was the hour Seren had come to love most, the particular quality of late evening when the corridors were still and the fire in their chambers had settled to steady coals, and Eric was sleeping, with the absolute, boneless commitment of a small person who had used every resource available to him that day and required complete resupply. Tonight, she was out the window, watching the courtyard frost over in the clear winter air, when she heard the door. Calder came in, shed his outer cloak, checked the cradle in the way he always did, one hand briefly on the blanket, the gray one, never the cream, and crossed to where she stood. He did not ask if she was all right. He had learned, over 2 years, the difference between her thinking silence and her "something is wrong" silence, and had calibrated his responses accordingly. He stood beside her at the window. Their shoulders touched. "He called me Dada this evening," Calder said after a while, "when I was putting him down." She turned to look at him. His face was, as always, composed. But she knew the gradations beneath the surface now, with the intimacy of someone who has been paying close attention for a long time. He was undone. Quietly, completely, in the way that only the small things manage to undo him. Not war, not political crisis, but a 10-month-old saying a word in the firelit dark. "Did you respond?" she asked. "I didn't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said. "He knows." Calder looked back at the courtyard. The frost was thick on the stone now, the whole inner keep glittering under a clear sky. Ash moved below them, making her last circuit of the evening, a habit so old it had become architecture. "I didn't think," he said, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man choosing words with the same precision he chose everything, "that this was available to me." She waited. After everything, after the war and the years of it, I understood what I was good for, what the crown required. I had made my peace with the shape of it. He paused. I had not made my peace with the absence. I had simply stopped naming it. "I know," she said softly. "You knew before I did." "I had 5 years of data." He turned to look at her, and she saw it again. The thing she had first seen in the throne room. The thing that had no name in any court history she had ever read. The look of a man who has been seen by someone he did not expect to survive being seen by, and found himself not diminished by it, but expanded. He lifted his hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The same gesture, 2 years in, still deliberate, still gentle in the way that large and careful things were gentle. "I was alone," he said, "for a long time." "I know. I am not, anymore." "No," she agreed, "you're not." Outside, Ash completed her circuit and lay down across the threshold of the outer door with a decisive exhale. As if to say, the perimeter is secured, all persons accounted for, the matter remains concluded. Good night. Eirik slept. The coals burned low in the hearth, and the King of Stormhaven, who had never needed anyone to understand him, stood at the window, with his wife's shoulder warm against his, and breathed out the last of a silence he had been keeping for 17 years. It did not leave a gap. It left room. The best love stories are not the ones that end at the altar. They are the ones that keep going, past the vows and into the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of two people choosing each other again and again, in the small hours, in the quiet rooms, in the way one of them always remembers how the other takes their tea. That is not an ending. That is the whole point.